Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing restoration housing. These webinars are brought to you in part by funding through the Ohio Department of Development and the Ohio Arts Council. Today, we're going to be speaking with Isabel Thornton. Isabel is the executive director of Restoration Housing, which she founded in 2014 out of a passion for historic preservation and affordable housing. She received a BA in architectural history from the University of Virginia and a master's of historic preservation and a master's of planning in historic preservation and urban planning from the University of Southern California. She serves on the real estate development committee, for community housing partners and the Blue Ridge Interagency Council on Homelessness. She is also a board member for Carolian Medical Center. Isabel lives on a farm in Botetourt County with her husband and 4 children. Isabel, I'm going to turn things over to you, and could you explain a little bit more about restoration housing?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be able to speak about our work outside of Virginia for once. So thank you for your interest in our work. So yes, I am the executive director of Restoration Housing, which is a nonprofit local housing developer in Roanoke, Virginia. And we're in the mountains of Virginia, the Blue Ridge Mountains, Appalachian Mountains, and it's fairly large city in Virginia, but not very well known outside of Virginia. And our mission is twofold. And then we are, oops, I'm having trouble now. Oh, here we go. Okay, we have a twofold mission to develop affordable rental properties for the benefit of limited income families and individuals through the rehabilitation and preservation of historic architectural resources. So we are essentially straddling the worlds of preservation and affordable housing. Our work is to restore blighted and vacant properties, typically in older historic neighborhoods in Roanoke. And then once we finish the rehabs, we own and manage them as affordable housing. So we are landlords, and we are overseeing large-scale restorations of homes that typically have been vacant for 10 years or so. So it's a little bit interesting to straddle these two worlds and see the disparities between the two worlds. You know, in the affordable housing world tends to be focused on much larger scale projects than ours. Ours are smaller homes. And the preservation world, and I think historically, has always looked at sort of these larger projects. Downtown restorations in Roanoke were a lot of what we used to see turning into lofts and market rate apartments, things like that. So we're trying to bring together these two worlds and doing really small scale development, which is not seen that often. And so we are, again, community based. We are not working outside of Roanoke, and you really can't, I think, do what we do outside of a regional approach and do it effectively, because we're really centered on neighborhoods and the needs of the community. So to just give you a little background on Roanoke, because that is essential to understand our model, but I think that we are dealing with neighborhoods that are really similar throughout the country. These are houses from one of our older historic neighborhoods is called Old Southwest Roanoke. And these homes were built at the turn of the century. We are a industrial, now post-industrial boomtown. Roanoke grew as sort of a gateway city, railroad city to westward expansion, and really didn't start to grow until the 1890s, which is considered kind of new for Virginia. And so Roanoke grew exponentially from the 1890s until probably the 1920s. And a lot of the housing stock in these neighborhoods reflect that boomtown growth and that aesthetic from the turn of the century. The neighborhoods I refer to are the first rung neighborhoods right outside of the downtown core. And a lot of them are still have this beautiful housing stock that has been, I say beautiful because I see great bones and great potential in a lot of these houses, but the vacancy rate is quite high. And I imagine that in Ohio you have a lot of similarities. I think you see a lot of the same kind of patterns of growth and deterioration in post-industrial cities. and especially cities that have lost population over time for various reasons, whether it's loss of industry or people moving out to the suburbs. But in Roanoke, we had a combination of those factors. And in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the houses were acquired by slumlords at distressed prices, and many of them were owned and then mismanaged for decades. So you see a lot of deterioration from mismanagement and a lot of deterioration from vacancy, and just a great need for reinvestment. So these neighborhoods have not seen a lot of investment for decades. Um, Many of them, like I said, are empty, these houses, but the ones that are occupied um, have really substandard living conditions. They might even have affordable rents, but they're very substandard. And there's just a strong need for both public and private reinvestment. And where people don't see a resale value, you don't really see people wanting to come in and restore homes on their own. And so that's why it's really critical for us as a nonprofit. We're able to come in and invest large sums of money into the restoration of these homes because we're not looking for a resale value. And we're able to get grants and fundraising that help us afford these costs, and we're not looking for a return on our investment. So it's really critical as a nonprofit to be an instigator and catalyst for reinvestment, which is the first part of what we do. And I'm going to get into this later as we talk, but when I talk about these two worlds of preservation and affordable housing, they typically have not overlapped much in a lot of what I've seen over the years. But as you talk about this, I think through the lens of neighborhoods and specifically historic neighborhoods, like the ones I'm describing, and I'm sure like the ones that you all have seen, you can really understand how these two worlds are intrinsically connected, and why there's such a need for both affordability and preservation. And when I talk about preservation, I'm really just talking about reinvesting, restoring homes that need that reinvestment, that need that reactivation, and have been vacant and blighted for many years. So that's why we do what we do, because there's a lot of opportunities in Roanoke. I'm going to show you our first project. This is 530 Day Avenue. This is in the Old Southwest Historic District that I was just talking about. This home was vacant for 10 years when we acquired it. It had been previously used as a 5-unit flop house, and the previous two owners, after the 5-unit use, had tried to bring it back to a single family home, and it's about 3,200 square feet. And it just needed so much work after being mismanaged for so long that a single family homeowner trying to rehab a 3,200 square foot house in a neighborhood, excuse me, my slides are jumping ahead, in a neighborhood that doesn't have a strong resale value, really the economics of that plan just didn't work. And that's why those previous two owners that wanted to turn it into single family couldn't. They ran out of, I guess the economics didn't work before they started construction, and they stopped and tried to resell it. And eventually then we came in, we bought it at a distressed rate, but we were able to put a lot of money into the construction because we were using historic tax credits. And because once we completed construction, we plan to have it be 2 units instead of 1. So it is actually a duplex. You enter the top unit through the back of the house. There's a rear porch, so it doesn't have an exterior stair. It doesn't obviously look like a duplex. Oops, sorry. And it has 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms on the ground floor, 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms on the second floor. And it's a really high quality outcome. We had custom cabinets, granite countertops, new appliances, and then all the features of a historic tax credit remodel, which meant original hardwood windows, original flooring restored, original doors, solid core doors restored, all trim is restored. The front porch was rebuilt to what it was before, and all the exterior features were restored in kind. So, tax credit projects require a high quality rehab. And then we also just really wanted to offer alternatives to the substandard housing that you see so much throughout these older neighborhoods. This is actually workforce housing, which means that it's serving people that make about 80% of the area median income, which is still affordable housing, but it's not very low income affordable housing. We thought there was a strong need for that in this particular neighborhood where we were working. And so we were able to keep our rents low and meet the income needs of the workforce families that live there, because we put 2 units in and because we used historic tax credits. But we ultimately still had debt on this project. This being our first project, we didn't have a lot of grant funding to offset all the construction costs. And as I get into the economics in a little bit, we'll see how we learned to fully subsidize construction with grants a little bit later on. Um, and that allows us to really be, I think, confident that we can keep our rents really low for a very long time. And it gives us organizational stability, not having debt, ongoing debt with each project, allowing us to put more money into our next project. So this was a great first project for us. But what I love about it is I think that it very subtly integrates affordable housing in a way that matches most single family housing that you might see in an older neighborhood. It subtly integrates it, which I think has a positive outcome of um, reducing the stigma of affordable housing, reducing the stigma of rental housing, and reducing the stigma of multifamily housing. And that's really easily done when you use an older historic home than if you were to build new. And so, in my opinion, using these historic homes for affordable housing is one of the greatest ways that we can show that affordable housing is not scary for a neighborhood, but in fact a great asset for a neighborhood. So for anybody that's here that is not familiar with affordable housing and what that means, because I do think I'm talking largely to an audience of preservationists, but when I say affordable housing, that does refer to a broad spectrum of incomes. Affordable housing is essentially affordability, so rents that are based on income and not based on what a market landlord can receive. So in any given city, market rents are based on what landlords think they can get, looking at other apartments and looking at what tenants will pay. And affordable housing, it's best when it's done by nonprofits, but it can be either rental or home ownership. But in our case, we're talking about rental. All of our properties are rental housing. And that means that all of our rents are no more than 30% of a tenant's income, and that includes utilities. Once you spend more than 30% of your income on housing, you're considered cost burdened, which typically means that you are going to be unable to pay for other critical expenses. And then often that does mean that your rent is a burden and you're not going to be able to pay your rent. So I think any good landlord that is concerned about making sure that their tenant will stay safely housed is usually concerned that their income does not that their income will meet their rent and be affordable for them and no more than 30% of their income. So that's a big part of what we do. But when we say affordable, it can mean anything from people making 80% of the area median income, which, like we said before, is workforce housing, to people with no income at all. And so affordable covers a broad spectrum of needs. It's anything that isn't market rate. And there are many people that have no income at all that need affordable housing. They typically also need housing vouchers that pay their rent. But there are people that make between 30 and 50% of the area median income that need special subsidies. And then a lot of our tenants, most of our projects on average, are serving families that make between 50 and 60% of the area median income. And so those families need very affordable rents that are based off of their income. So that's what we do. But like I said, we have projects that cover all kinds of ranges from workforce to no income. We have a project that's permanent supportive housing, which is for people with no income. It's 4 units for formerly homeless individuals. And they're able to stay there through a partnership with a nonprofit that does the social service providing, and they pay the rent through a permanent supportive housing voucher. So we have the full gamut of affordability in what we do, but we only have a handful of projects and we're definitely small scale. We base the decisions on the affordability based off of the neighborhood that we're working in, what the housing needs of that neighborhood are, what the surrounding rents of that neighborhood are, and what the city tells us is the strongest need of affordable housing. So we typically talk to our city planners and our city HUD department to find out what they feel the strongest need is, and we try to meet that need. So to give you a little background in the affordable housing world of a lot of what exists now, a lot of developers of affordable housing throughout the country use low-income housing tax credits, which is a wonderful subsidy that offsets construction costs significantly so that developers can create very affordable units with the construction costs being lowered. There's very little debt. These are two projects that an organization called A Community of Friends built in Los Angeles. And this is a group that I worked for when I was in graduate school out there. And they used LIHTC, which is low income housing tax credits. We call it LIHTC. These projects, in order to be awarded LIHTC, typically have to be competitive based on a number of criteria, but density is, of course, important. They typically wouldn't have fewer than 40 units in a project. Proximity to libraries, public transportation, schools, social services, a lot of things are taken into account, and these projects are awarded credits in a competitive way based on meeting that criteria. So what ends up happening is the projects that are built are not really responding to a specific community need. They're not usually integrated into an existing neighborhood landscape or streetscape that matches what's around them. They're, as you can see, these were designed by some fancy architects, and they're quite interesting in their own way, but they stand out. And in my opinion, projects with this level of density and with the I think kind of boldness of the architecture, the newness of all of it, can sometimes create more of a NIMBY backlash. That's not in my backyard backlash. Neighbors don't really love to see dense, affordable housing, multi-unit projects like this. And the developers that built them are used to that kind of backlash, and they have workarounds, and they find a way to get these projects built, and they serve a great need. And they also serve a lot of people that really need this kind of housing. And this is permanent supportive housing in Los Angeles. So this is also people coming out of homelessness. And this is really wonderful, high quality housing that gives people dignity in a way that most PSH housing can't. So I'm a fan of this, but I do think that the model is a very specific type of model that doesn't work specifically for smaller cities and towns. And in areas where there is NIMBY backlash, there is something quite positive that can come from having what we think of as this sort of smaller scale rehab of historic structures that subtly integrate into the existing neighborhood. And where I first found that, I was studying at the same time while working for those developers, I was studying preservation at USC and looking to models in Pasadena, California, where they were restoring these smaller historic homes. These are bungalow courts that they were restoring into affordable housing, which I thought was really fascinating. These were older turn of the century structures that they had found to be a really great model of housing that people loved. They're little detached homes centered around a courtyard. And a lot of this is very trendy right now. You might see a lot of new construction like this as well, these sort of pocket neighborhoods. But they were building this in 1908 in Pasadena, and 100 years later, they were restoring them and trying to make sure that they were being preserved into affordable housing, which I thought was fascinating. And so I started studying this model, and I came across a group called Heritage Housing Partners, also in Pasadena, and they were restoring small-scale, vacant, dilapidated, historic structures with incredible character and seeing the potential in them and turning them into affordable housing. And I was mesmerized by this model that could exist, because everything I'd seen of affordable housing before was this larger scale construction, and it was all new construction. And the group that I was working with that did new construction, they were trying to find older buildings to rehab. They wanted to twin LIHTC with historic tax credits, which is also, a very competitive, helpful way to cover all your construction costs. But those projects were harder for them to make work competitively for LIHTC. So they ended up not really being competitive, and they ended up doing more new construction than old. But this group in Pasadena, Heritage Housing Partners, was not using LIHTC in all of their projects. They were focused more on finding alternative funding models. One thing that was really interesting, the picture on the left there is actually a green and green apartment building that was built by them. I didn't know they were building apartment buildings, but it was kind of unique and maybe early on in their careers. And it was turn of the century stucco, and it's now 4 affordable housing units. Heritage Housing Partners, this building was actually slated for demolition, if you can believe that. And they had it picked up by a truck and moved across the city, moved across Pasadena, and resecured and then restored, and is 4 affordable housing units. So that was really inspirational to me to see a group doing this kind of work and seeing that it could be done, planted the seed for our work, and knowing that there's a possibility to try to do small scale preservation that's affordable. So to talk a little bit about, I think, Roanoke and how Roanoke mirrors other cities across the country, one of the reasons that we've lost, I think, interest in these historic neighborhoods that I think many cities have suffered from similar issues, like I said before, is loss of industry. But dramatically for us, we've noticed a pattern in the neighborhoods that were redlined and the historic neighborhoods, because the historic neighborhoods were all either redlined or yellow lined. And for those of you that aren't familiar with redlining, it was a practice in the 1930s where maps were created across cities in America to basically show risk to banks for loaning mortgages. And neighborhoods were deemed riskier if they were red, still quite risky if they were yellow, but not quite as bad. And then neighborhoods that were coded blue and green were considered desirable. So they became quick and fast ways for banks to decide if they should lend to these neighborhoods or not. Most of this practice was race-based and was very problematic in many ways. And the accounting was, you can see in Virginia what your city maps looked like on a website called Redlining in Virginia. And I'm not sure what else is available outside of Virginia, but a lot of these records are accessible. And this is Roanoke's map. I've highlighted little stars where our properties are located, and we have 7 properties right now. And they are all in neighborhoods that if you map, and we did do this, we got a map from the city's police department showing us all the vacant properties in the city. And this was probably 6 or 7 years ago, so it's not as up to date. I didn't want to show it, but it had all of the clustered vacancy is directly correlated to the neighborhoods that were redlined. So to me, it's incredibly obvious why you see a loss of investment in neighborhoods that can't attain loans. But it still surprises me that 90 years after this practice went into play, that the effects are still so dramatic. And the neighborhoods that we work in are the historic neighborhoods. All of the historic neighborhoods in Roanoke were either red or yellow lined, which is also crazy to me when you think about these houses and these neighborhoods and what assets they were to the city originally and still are, and how negative and long-term impact this practice could have. So what we see our work as being so critically about reinvesting in these neighborhoods because they've been systematically devalued for decades. And when we do one rehab, it's a tiny little step forward, but we often see other people reinvesting also homeowners reinvesting. People around these neighborhoods are feeling inspired by the work that we do. Other nonprofits are doing their share of reinvestment as well. So even though we're just 7 properties, we're seeing other efforts simultaneously happening and reinvesting all around us. So it's encouraging, even though this is a fairly depressing topic to think about and the effects that it's had over time. So this is a property in Southeast Roanoke. I'm going to go back to this slide. And the lower right quadrant, where there are those 4 stars clustered together, the star on the left side is this house that we're looking at. This neighborhood is called Belmont in Southeast Roanoke. And it is, this house was built in the 1890s and was home to one of Roanoke's earliest mayors. And he was actually twice mayor of Roanoke, and it's large for the neighborhood. The neighborhood has a lot of houses that are more in the 2,700 square foot range. This one is 3,200 square feet. I think a beautiful Queen Anne home. Even before you see the after picture, you can see that the bones were there, the details were there, and it was quite interesting. It has slate tile roof, a little turret at the top. And we think it actually was kind of always a duplex, as strange as that sounds. Actually, we found many houses that were always duplexes, but this one, you know, an older, larger Queen Anne like this with the mayor living in it, you wouldn't necessarily think that. But we went back through some city directories and found evidence that there's sort of this right wing side of the house that was built parallel to the main house, was built several years after the first phase, and it was, I think, belonged to the mayor's sister. So we love that these older neighborhoods often had light density built into these bigger homes. That was kind of always part of the deal. And these historic neighborhoods typically employed either light density always or during an economic downturn. And this is what we talked about in our Plan Edison article that, you know, was about how middle housing, which is sort of light density housing, was intrinsic to our historic neighborhoods in Roanoke, and I think throughout. You would see people take renters on, or you know, have a little flat in the back, or duplexes that were built as duplexes but fit really naturally around their single family neighbors. And it really wasn't until mid-century that we started to build neighborhoods and zone neighborhoods so that they could only be one way and one kind of either multifamily or single family. But this house, when people started to move out of this neighborhood was redlined and dramatically, you know, affected by that. The interstate also was put in at the end of the street, so it dead ends into the interstate. It has the largest homeless shelter in the region right across the street from this house. So it's a neighborhood that really doesn't have much, you know, market at all in terms of renters wanting to live there. And we knew that we were up against that as a real concern for people that would want to live in this neighborhood, no matter what this house could look like, even if it was beautiful. So we turned this into 4 permanent supportive housing units for people coming out of homelessness and people that could actually use the shelter as a resource. They can get meals at the shelter. They receive consistent supportive services from another area local nonprofit, and they are. We've had great success with the happiness of the tenants living here. This is the outcome of the work that we did. So we used historic tax credits like we do on all of our projects. And we kept the 4 units that it was divided into when we were gifted this house. It was being last used as 4 units. We kept it as 4 units. We added an ADA unit on the ground floor and a ramp, but most of the rest of it was restored in kind, and the porch was rebuilt to what was there originally. The units are almost identical to what was there before, but just restored in kind. And the ADA unit obviously has some alterations with a roll-in shower, but we found this to be a wonderful form of preservation and affordable housing that doesn't look like dense multifamily or affordable. And we were able to do this project largely because of permanent supportive housing money that is available through the state of Virginia. Our state office for housing is the Department of Housing and Community Development, and they have a state housing trust fund that prioritizes funding for permanent supportive housing hard costs for construction. So we got a significant grant for that. We used historic tax credits, and then we also do smaller scale fundraising and smaller scale foundation grants that we use mostly for upfront pre-development costs when we're first beginning a project, like our architectural and engineering fees, and anything that involves feasibility, like environmental testing and things like that. So our actual construction costs were subsidized largely from the tax credits and the DHCD grant. So we really see, in order for us to cover the very substantial costs of construction for these rehabs, because these houses being vacant for or mismanaged for as long as they are have very substantial costs, it's really critical that we combine sources that come just from the preservation world, which is historic tax credits, and sources that come just from the affordable housing world. And we wouldn't be able to do these projects if we were in just one of those lanes. If we were just trying to create affordable housing, we'd have a significant gap if we weren't trying to also use tax credits. So marrying these two worlds, again, is really critical for us from an economic standpoint in order to fully subsidize our costs. So this project has no debt, and we receive rental subsidies for the tenants. And it, like I said, it performs quite well, and the tenants seem happy. And we think it's a lovely example of this kind of work. And one of the reasons that this neighborhood that we're working in, and this project in particular, is where we're really focused right now, is that it's in an area that is the confluence of both a newly established historic district, and it's a target area for our City of Roanoke HUD funding. So when we're marrying the two worlds of preservation and affordable housing, it's really key that we be in a neighborhood that's both a historic district and working with houses that are contributors to that district in order to receive tax credits. And we want to be in an area where we know we can receive the affordable housing grant funding that we need. So this is the Belmont Historic District, and the yellow house I just showed you is one of the first projects to use historic tax credits in this district. We started the project in 2019, and the district had just been established. The greatest thing about this district is that it is just a national district and not a local one, so we don't have to worry about an ARB or the neighbors that get a little nervous about things like that. We're quelled by knowing that the national district is really just an incentive. And we, of course, are not usually worried too much about ARBs, because when we're building in compliance with the Secretary of the Interior standards, they're usually going to be in compliance with local ARBs anyway. So, but it's still an ideal situation to be in this new district. And we have 4 properties in it now, largely because, like I said, it's both, we know that we're going to have the accessibility of the tax credits, and because this is also the city's target area for HUD funding. So the map we're looking at now is a map of the Belmont Fallon target area, which in Roanoke we call that BAFTA. City of Roanoke receives HUD funding. We're an entitlement city. Most larger cities across the country that receive HUD funding as an entitlement city, that they distribute as they like. In our city, they're distributing it through CDBG, which is Community Development Block Grant Funding, or home funds that both come from HUD. And our local jurisdiction chooses to spend that money annually. It's a competitive grant process for nonprofits to receive it, and they focus the funding in a specific area for 5 years as a target area. And I don't believe all jurisdictions do it that way. Some jurisdictions will let nonprofits use it anywhere that needs revitalization, but it's It's essentially funding meant specifically for revitalization and affordable housing. So they also fund Habitat for Humanity, that will be building new affordable homeownership opportunities. Um, they use it for weatherization grants. They use it for another group called Renovation Alliance locally that's doing emergency home repairs. So it's revitalization and affordable focused. And this is the target area for the city right now and for the next few years. So it's really wonderful for us. We wanted to be in this neighborhood. We see that there's a really strong need in this neighborhood. The neighborhood of Southeast Roanoke has a vacancy rate of about 18% of the housing stock is vacant. It also has a 68% rental rate, which means that the 68% of the people living in Belmont are renters, and most of that rental housing is substandard. So we're trying to create alternatives and better quality alternatives, but we're also trying to bring these vacant homes back to life. The vacancy is a real issue that strains the Roanoke Police Department. It strains our code enforcement. It strains all of the city's fire and rescue and just so many different versions of city strains from vacant housing stock. And um, we see fires more often here. We see drug overdoses more often here. So really finding solutions to restoring vacant housing is a big problem. I mean, it's a big effort that the city wants to see. So that's why they target this area so they can see as much revitalization in a condensed period of time as possible. So since the Yellow House, we've done 2 other houses with the third on the way that are all targeting families making between 50 and 60% of the area median income. And we get that grant funding that helps offset our costs in conjunction with the tax credits, and that's how we keep the costs completely covered. So this is another project in that neighborhood. This is a little folk Victorian house. It's called we just name the house as the address. So we call this 820 Dale. I love this house. It's only about 1,800 square feet. It's a single family rental. So it's a 3-bedroom. It actually can be 4 bedrooms. And it is, we think there's a really strong need in the affordable housing, community. There's a strong need for more family housing, but families really want and need the amenities of single family homes. But if they're renting and say they have a Section 8 voucher, with our tenant that lives here does, they want to be able to have the amenities of a single family home, but through renting. And this house is a wonderful opportunity where few exist, with a yard, backyard, porches, detached or a separate parking in the back, and a large and spacious detached home. So we think it's hard to find these projects. It's hard to make these economics work, which is why they're hard to find. But this house, being in the neighborhood that I just described, that we have the resources available, really was a great opportunity for us to make this kind of difficult model work. This house had a very small hole in the rear of the roof, and had been vacant for at least 5 or 6 years. And in that period of vacancy with the small hole in the roof, many of you in the preservation world probably won't be surprised to know that the interior was in shambles, and many people advised that we should tear it down, including several structural engineers that we talked to. It had the floor systems on the first and second story had completely deteriorated, and you couldn't really even access the rear of the house. And the rear of the house, you could see from the basement to the ceiling joists. And so we had a very trustworthy and hopeful builder that we've worked with many times, who felt confident that this could be done and helped us find a way to create engineering drawings that could be approved and used for a special grant that was offered from Virginia Housing, which is our local housing authority, I mean, our statewide housing authority. It was a grant specifically for either demolition or stabilization. And I think in many areas like ours and other post-industrial cities, this is a great resource for people with our neighborhoods and communities with a lot of vacant housing stock to either demolish what is considered a hazard to the neighborhood or stabilize what is a hazard to the neighborhood so that it then can be restored. And so we received $85,000 from Virginia Housing to stabilize the house, which that very helpful contractor allowed us to do and did for us. And he, removed debris and demoed the back section of debris, rebuilt the roof in the back, and reframed the back and the floor systems of the first and second story. He stabilized and poured structural supports in the basement. And that was his job only. It was a two-phased construction. And so after that stabilization money was spent, we completed the second phase, which was the historic rehab. And we used a different contractor for that to restore using all of the same criteria as before and in compliance with tax credits where I'll show you pictures in just a second, but restoring original windows and trim and doors and floors and all the exterior details and bringing it back to life. So you can see the economics of this one as well. Again, really critical to have both the housing grants. So we received community development block grant funding that I described before, being in the target area for the city of Roanoke. We received Virginia housing funding. Both of those require that the project be affordable housing. So we would not be able to restore this house if we hadn't had those grants. And then the tax credits were another essential piece. And then some fundraising and smaller foundation gifts covered all of our expenses. So this one is likewise fully subsidized. And so we just have one rental stream, which is really low, but because we have no debt, we're able to cover our maintenance and expenses and even pay ourselves a management fee for this property. And the last bit I'm going to do, I think, let me see here, a little video of the house to show you guys a before and after of what, to give you a really clear idea of what the houses, the transformation that the houses undergo. But before I do that, I just wanted to kind of circle back to, I think, the interest that we have in preservation of affordable housing and why they seem so intrinsically linked. Most of our historic neighborhoods have lacked investment for decades. They've been redlined and they were blighted and vacant and in desperate need for reinvestment. And they also have a majority percentage of renters, and most of the rental opportunities are substandard. And because we want to keep these neighborhoods affordable and not push people out, it's really critical to keep these rents low and to match them to what a lot of the existing rents are. But again, those rents are usually substandard housing. So just kind of reiterating why I think these two things are both so important to each other, the reinvestment and the affordability, and why also from an economic standpoint, why they're critical if you want to fully subsidize the cost, because otherwise you could take on too much debt and rents to match the debt service would then potentially gentrify neighborhood and have that negative outcome as well. So I'm going to play the video, and then after that, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. And we'll see if this works. If not, I think we've got a backup plan, so we'll see. Okay, well, that was it. So I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Isabel. And if anyone has any questions, go ahead and type those into the chat box now. To start off with, we had a couple questions. I'm going to combine these into a massive question. Uh, so people were wondering, does when you were referring to historic tax credits, obviously there's a federal one. Is there a Virginia one too? And were
Yes,
you using both?
yes, we are always using both. We have 20 and 25%. And so we combine both, and that's essentially why our projects are all rental housing too, because federal credits require that it be an income producing property. And so we both, make our properties rental property to meet that compliance. That's a 5-year compliance, but also because there's a strong need, we're trying to meet the need of rental housing as well.
And is Virginia's competitive like Ohio's, where in Ohio, kind of there's $60 million or $120 million, depending on
Mhm.
the period of time, and essentially projects compete based upon a scoring system, and the higher scored ones get it. Is Virginia's kind of the similar?
Thankfully, no, we're not competitive. I think it's uh, unfortunate, in that case, because like I said, with low-income housing tax credits, the competitive nature of it makes you sort of have to build a project out of competitiveness more than where there's maybe actually a need. So we have seemingly no limit with our state credits.
Thanks, Isabel. So on our next question here is from Brent. How can we proactively minimize the vacancy period for rehab candidates to reduce rehab costs? You have any suggestions for him?
Okay, let me see if I understand that question. How can we reduce vacancy periods? Is that right?
Yeah. So essentially, between when you're, let's just say if a house is occupied currently in the rental form, and you're going to rehab it, cutting down on that gap between when it's vacated and when it's reoccupied.
Oh gosh, I don't know that I can speak as any kind of expert on that because most of the properties that we take on have been vacant for many years. So we've never really turned something around from occupancy to restored in a quick turnaround setting. It's always been vacant from when we began. So if I understood that question incorrectly and he wants to re-ask it, I'm happy to reconsider it. But I think if I understand it correctly, then I wouldn't be the right person to ask.
Thanks, Isabel. Next question is from Kirby. Is this neighborhood seeing the corporate rental housing bulk purchase phenomenon that we are seeing in Ohio, where investors buy up blocks of housing for cheap and rent it out without fixing them up? Can you compete with that? And are you just focusing on houses, even that they wouldn't buy?
We're not seeing that, but I am familiar with that, and I think it is happening in areas with stronger rental markets and with maybe potentially stronger rental markets with, a fair amount of sort of uh, what is the term I'm looking for? But I think what I would say a similar situation that we deal with that's not exactly the same. We have trouble finding houses that we want to buy because of either other slumlords. Slumlords want to buy houses that have been owned by other slumlords and they kind of trade them back and forth. Or we have trouble reaching the owners. They, live out of state or they died and their heirs are scattered or there's just no way to reach them and they don't seem to have cell phones and they might live in assisted living. It's all the gamut. There's so many different scenarios. We have a really hard time sometimes finding owners or purchasing properties that we want that are competitive with slumlords that can put a lot more money into acquisition than we can. And what I would say is one of the best resources that just came about really in the last year here is our local land bank was formed. That was a state law that passed, I think, in like 2016 or 17, I'm not sure, that allowed Virginia jurisdictions to create their own land banks. And Roanoke created one a couple years ago, but has only just now got it up and running. The land bank allows the land bank is an entity that pulls properties before they go to tax auction and can give them or sell them directly to either socially minded for-profit entities or nonprofits at the directly assessed tax rate, so, or not rate, sorry, the assessed value. So instead of competing with slumlords for a property that we would want to buy, it would be set aside and allowed to buy at the assessed value. And that's something that is really a game changer for us. We're no longer trying desperately to find owners. We're no longer going to need to compete with acquisition costs that we can't afford, and paying assessed value for a property that's really down on its luck like this one. It's usually kind of affordable for us. But as soon as you get into a competitive war with somebody that's not planning to reinvest any money, but has lots of money for acquisition, then it pushes us out of the process. So if you don't have land banks yet, or you have the ability to create them, I think they're a wonderful tool that can really help in those instances.
Thanks, Isabel. Our next question is sort of dealing with the tenants. Getting a tenant is always a little bit of a gamble. How are you protecting the historic integrity of the homes? Is that written into the rental agreement? Typically, obviously, there's obviously don't destroy clauses and things like that
Yeah.
in leases. But do you have any comments on that?
Well, I don't know that I'm an expert on this yet either. We haven't had any really problematic issues with historic features being damaged by tenants. We have had issues with, all kinds of, you know, things that you would see typically of any kind of rental situation where, a tenant, um, I don't want to get into any really unfortunate specifics, but just didn't take good care of the unit and didn't get their deposit back. And we had to repaint everything or fumigate or, do just a really deep clean. But we haven't had anything where either, historic features like windows or doors or columns or anything like that were affected or disturbed. So I haven't dealt with that personally to say that there's, I think, a protective clause that you could put in your lease. There may be, and that's probably a question for a landlord and tenant lawyer. But I think that we build we're working on, as we learned to understand this process more too each year. We created a maintenance fund that allows us to pay for these costs. Historic homes have a greater maintenance, I think, and upkeep than newer homes do. And in some ways, they outlast the newer homes, and in other ways, they need more consistent care. So we have that fund built in, and we're paying into it every month, so that when there are these larger restoration costs, that are connected to it being an older home, we'll be able to offset those costs. But from a specific standpoint of a tenant, we haven't dealt with that yet for it to be an issue.
Thanks, Isabel. Cycling back to Brent's earlier question about the gap in time between renovation and reoccupancy. He says idle, empty houses, often due to institutionalization of aging owners or indifferent heirism, deteriorate quickly. Can we intervene through some means to make those houses available for rehab sooner rather than later?
Oh, okay, I understand that now better. I mean, oh gosh, I would say there would be so many ways I would love to see more interventions not being able to find the owners like he listed is one of the hardest things in our job. You know, we find houses, see houses all the time that we think would be great contenders, and we can't get a hold of the owners. We see them deteriorating right before our eyes, and there's nothing we can do about it. It comes down to code enforcement locally and what they're able to do in some cases to houses that are considered a hazard. And little, you know, in Roanoke, the jurisdiction power that they have to do that is limited. It's really a state law that limits us. So that basically allows vacant houses to persist longer than we would want them to. If we had more local power, I think for code enforcement and even police officers to intervene when houses are clearly vacant and, you know, making code violations left and right or condemned, then it would allow, I think, more interventions. And then I think things like the stabilization grant that I described, that's from our housing, our state housing authority, that's called Virginia Housing. They used to be called VHDA. They, I think they created that funding as a source of funding to mitigate deterioration of vacant structures so that either developers or cities could then take the next steps necessary. So that being a resource here is a big deal. And to the extent that other states are able to create that resource, it would be really helpful, I think.
Thanks. And Monica in our audience is also commenting in Ohio. The Montgomery County Treasurer's Office is planning on including a deed transfer upon death form in future tax invoices to prevent some properties from being tied up in probate court. So that's a great option
That's
for
a
Ohio.
wonderful idea. I think I want to write it down. That's such a good idea. You know, I've been to some classes about heirs and how, you know, so many people say that that would be the solution if that could be really forced to be in front of people when they are purchasing properties to really think about these things. It would save cities. It would save, you know, neighbors. It would save everybody so much time and energy to not have that then be a big quagmire that's dealt with later. So can you just read that out loud one more time? Because I want to write it down.
Sure. So it's Montgomery County, which is where Dayton, Ohio is. They're creating in a future tax invoicing, a deed upon death form. So deed transfer upon death.
That's a wonderful idea. And I've heard that kind of loosely talked about, but I didn't know anywhere where that was being implemented.
So our next couple questions here, kind of dealing with management. How many staff people do you have allocated to managing your rentals, and how many units do you have under ownership and management?
Right. So we have, we're very small. Staff here is myself and 3 other people. We have a summer intern, so 4 right now, but we have staff that works in the actual management of our apartments and all the financial side of that work and all of our financial entries. Then we have a property maintenance staff person that is doing more of the actual site work. And then we have a development coordinator who does all of our help with marketing and fundraising and events. And that's it for our actual staff. But then with each rehab, you know, we contract out the work to a contractor. We've worked with the same contractor on 5 out of 6 of the rehabs and hopefully our 7th. And so we work with them consistently all the time, but they're just contracted out. And that was the staff question. Remind me, the second half of that question was
how many units do you have under ownership?
Okay. So we only have 12 units of rental housing right now, and then we have one large project that's 5,000 square feet. That's a commercial nonprofit co-working space. So it's a rehab of a really beautiful 200-year-old home that, because of the way that the home is, we didn't really want to change any of the floor plan of the home and the design of the home. It needed to stay exactly as it was, but it's in a neighborhood that didn't have a market for a 5,000 square foot single family home. So we actually lease it out to a church that leases it out, subleases it out as nonprofit co-working space, and it's sort of a community center. So we have one commercial tenant and then 12 housing tenants.
And do the rental fees cover ongoing maintenance and management costs?
They cover most of them. Yeah, we don't have debt on most of the properties, so they're able to cover most of the maintenance costs. And like I said, we created a reserve fund, so if we have a surprise kind of larger, as you know, with historic homes, something that comes out that exceeds most of it, like a monthly maintenance, then it would come out of that fund, which is through our nonprofit. The nonprofit has its own budget and fundraising and all of that. And then each house has its own budget, and each house is a separate business that pays our nonprofit a monthly management fee. And so we own those businesses and manage them, but they're created as separate entities, and that's largely because of the tax credit partnership structure and the way that that has to be designed.
Thanks. And also, Monica followed up with also ABLE, which is formerly known as the Legal Aid Society, has also been going to neighborhood meetings in Dayton area where a lot of elderly homeowners are and offering to help complete and filling out the transfer and death filings for homeowners. So it's another option
That's
for you in the future.
that's wonderful. Yeah, legal aid. Okay.
All right, just a couple more questions here. So we'll just tick right through these. Is there a Rehabitat for Humanity model, sort of with involving homes like this?
Habitat for Humanity does do rehabs. Locally, they started doing them as well. And they've actually bought a couple of vacant properties in this neighborhood because they've actually run out of vacant lots, which was their standard model. The only difference, and this is a good difference because we're still not really competing and we don't have the exact same mission, is that they are doing affordable home ownership after the rehabs. So where we're doing affordable rental, they're doing affordable home ownership. So we are now competing with them sometimes for the same properties in the same target area, but with the outcomes are different outcomes. So we're not trying to do the exact same thing. And so each habitat has the ability to do, I think, this a little differently. In Charlottesville, for instance, Virginia, I know they do even multifamily rental housing. So there are some habitats that do rental, but the one locally does do rehabs, but they're for home ownership. I guess it's just depends on the director where you are and what they're up for.
Thank you. Next couple are kind of more project-based, involving your projects. Does the area the project is in already have to be in a designated historic district in order to apply for credits? Typically, yeah.
I would say typically, yeah, 6 out of 7 of our projects were contributors to districts, and that was a big factor for us. And we have an eighth in a pipeline that's a contributor as well, but one wasn't. The large commercial nonprofit space that I spoke of was not in a district, and like I said, it was a really large 200-year-old house with like a lot of great historic, I think, legacy, both with the owners and the design and the architecture. And we knew that it would be enough of a contender on its own. And so we nominated it and listed it on the National Register. So if it's not a contributor to a district, that's always the alternative, is that, I mean, you want to use tax credits as you could get it on the National Register. That process is very long and complicated, and it takes a whole year just to do that on its own. But with the right kind of building, if it's big enough and the funding works to do it, because my background is in historic tax credits, so writing those nominations is not very difficult for us to do in-house, so we didn't have to hire a third party. Whereas if you have to hire a third party consultant, the economics don't always work out to get something listed. But if the project's big enough, it is an alternative. And I know many other tax credit developers that have had to do that given with specific projects.
And are any of your acquisitions the result of property tax foreclosures? And if so, are you given any priority in those foreclosure processes?
Cut off, did you say?
Sorry. So are any of the properties that you've acquired is a result of property tax foreclosures? And were you giving any priority if they were?
So none of these have been, the one we're looking at right now, the little yellow house, we bought it from a couple that had bought it at a tax auction unseen. And when they saw the inside, they immediately wanted to sell it to us. So we did not buy it from the auction, but it was one step removed. But that's largely, we tried to buy a property at tax auction and we were outbid. And that's where, going back to what I was saying about the land bank, the land bank would pull properties aside for entities like us to purchase the properties at assessed value before they go to auction. So that I think was the second part of that question. Land banks allow you to pull them aside and purchase them before that happens, and it's a huge asset for our city to have that. And so they just got their footing for the next auction, which is this September, I believe. So it'll be something we'd like to do soon and take advantage of soon, but we haven't been able to yet.
Final question. Are the vouchers project based?
So we have Section 8 vouchers with tenants that are probably half of our properties, and those were just tenants that had the vouchers from the local housing authority. So we don't have a project-based voucher project. Our 8th project that's in the pipeline, we're hoping will be a project-based voucher project, but that'll be a competitive process with our housing authority that we'd have to receive. So that's still not confirmed. Our permanent supportive housing project that's 4 units is kind of a special case scenario because permanent supportive housing vouchers they can't be offered as project-based. They are just offered to whomever has the highest need of housing locally. So we created basically an arrangement where we have an MOU with the nonprofit service provider that provides those vouchers to fill those 4 units with whomever is the highest need. And so we have 4 units of permanent supportive housing, and each of those units has a tenant with a voucher. But it's technically not project-based. It was sort of a workaround because we wanted it to be all PSH vouchers, but there aren't any entities that offer PSH project-based like that. So we just created a partnership with the service provider, if that makes sense. I know it's kind of complicated, and if anybody wants to follow up with me, I'm happy to get into more detail about that later. It's a real interest of mine to do more project-based work. But yeah, like I said, most of the tenants that have Section 8 vouchers just come to us with the vouchers, and they got them directly from the housing authority.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you to Restoration Housing for doing this webinar today with us. This was an excellent webinar. Please follow them along on Instagram. That's where I've been following them. So we have a couple upcoming webinars. Just want to tell everyone before we head out today. On August 2nd, we have a webinar on facade enhancement programs with the City of Tiffin and Downtown Tiffin, discussing their projects and how they established their facade enhancement program. And on August 23rd, we have a webinar. We're partnering with Greater Ohio and the Capital Facilities and Construction Corp for Ohio, preparing a successful bid for state capital budget dollars. So if you have capital budget projects that you're interested in doing, pay attention to that one. That's an easy way to make a successful bid. So thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you once again to Isabel. We hope you have a good day. Thanks, and see you at our next webinar.